Namaskaram. Good afternoon, all. You may have to fight a battle more than once to win it. Amidst the saddening reality of the ever increasing COVID positive cases, we have all gathered here online to participate in a national webinar. We have with us numerous academicians, plenty of research scholars and students from all over India. On behalf of St. Thomas College, Thrissur, I welcome all of you to this webinar. The Research and PG Department of English, St. Thomas College, Thrissur, in collaboration with Gandhigram Rural University, is organizing this national level webinar on postmodernism. Now, may I cordially invite Dr. Anto Thomas, Head of the Department of English, to deliver the welcome address.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome online to the national webinar on postmodernism organized in collaboration with Gandhigram Institute, the Rural Institute deemed to be university, and St. Thomas College, Thrissur. During this most pessimistic time of the pandemic, a webinar on postmodernism would definitely make us think on various elements and aspects of this literary theoretical movement. It's not just merely a theory, but it has been a cultural practice of the West, but it has now become an international cultural practice. And the broad skepticism and subjectivism, relativism, general suspicion of reason, acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power, the conceptual construct and artifact of the scientific practice of language, and the concept of truth, reality, human nature, and language all come into the purview of a discussion on postmodernism. We, from the Department of English of St. Thomas College, is proud to organize this webinar, and we would have organized it as a seminar because two of our young, energetic professors, the coordinators, the organizers of this webinar, Reverend Dr. Stishin Paul and Reverend Dr. Flergin Anthony, with all their enthusiasm, they have managed to come into contact with nearly 4,000 scholars who are interested in listening to Professor Dr. Joseph DORAIRAJ, the veteran scholar and the authority on literary criticism in the whole of South India. On this auspicious occasion, my duty is to welcome everyone online. First of all, I'd like to welcome the principal of the college, Dr. K.L. Joy, who has been our impetus and strength, who has always guided us to academic excellence. Dear sir, we would like to offer a very cordial and warm welcome to you. And we look forward to your felicitation to the listeners. Second, but most importantly, I would like to welcome the speaker, Professor Dr. Joseph DORAIRAJ, who has an academic career of more than 3 decades, who has been the Dean of the School of English and Foreign Language of Gandhigram Rural Institute. He is an eminent scholar, great administrator, and an academician par excellence. During the period from 2013 to 2014, he was the officiating Vice Chancellor of the Gandhigram Rural University. He has been a scholar known internationally. He was a Fulbright Fellow in 2014, and he visited very many education institutions in US, especially in Washington, D.C. and in New York and Miami. He was also the Erasmus Mundus Visiting Scholar of Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium in 2015. To his great honor and acknowledgement, he has been invited to conduct a month-long teacher training program in Kandy in Sri Lanka in August 2007. As a great scholar of eminence from our country, he has visited Georgian University, Rome, Radboud University, the Netherlands, Thrissur in Paris, and various other institutions. Professor DORAIRAJ is a great intellect of our times. He has published 55 articles and authored 4 books. His first book-length publication, Myth and Literature, a hermeneutical interpretation of James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, was published in 2001 by the Folklore Resources and Research Center in Tamil Nadu. This has been a publication that has been republished several times. He has also published books like Interventions, Essays in Philosophy and Literary Theory in 2006, Philosophical Hermeneutics in 2015, and his most popular publication is Frequently Asked Questions on Research in Literature and Language, published by Emerald Publications in Chennai in 2019. He has also edited 2 books, Critical Essays in Indian English Poets, 2015, and Essays on Gandhi, 2019. He was a visiting professor in philosophy at Satyam Nilayam, affiliated to the Madras University from 2009 to 2012, and a visiting professor of English at Osmania University in 2016. He is the founder editor of the Gandhigram Literary Review. Above all, he has been an assessor of the NAC since 2010. He was deeply involved in the preparation of the NAC's revised methodology, and he has assessed 31 colleges and universities all over the country. 13 times he has been the chairperson of the NAC peer team. Now, to St. Thomas College, Thrissur, Dr. DORAIRAJ has always been a well-wisher as well as a frequent visitor. He has come to our institution many times, I think, even since 1990s. And this long-term academic relationship with Gandhigram Rural Institute, University, and the veteran scholars, a genuine authority on language and literary criticism. We look forward to you, sir, to a wonderful academic performance this afternoon, and we welcome you to be with us online. Now, let me quickly welcome the Bursar of the College, Reverend Father Dr. Martin Kolambrath, who has been a scholar under the guidance of Dr. DORAIRAJ, who has given us all infrastructural facilities for the organization of this webinar. I would like to welcome Ms. Christeena, the member of the faculty, the organizers, Dr. Flergin and Dr. Stishin Paul, other faculty members who are attending this webinar online, both from the side of Gandhigram Rural Institute, the deemed to be university, and St. Thomas College. A hearty welcome to participants from different academic institutions, professors, research scholars, students from different four corners of all over the country. We, from the side of St. Thomas College, as the organizers, like to wish you all a fruitful academic afternoon. And this is a time to thank Gandhigram Rural Institute on behalf of the Department of English for being with us online in collaboration, and the Department of English St. Thomas College is proud to organize, along with the Gandhigram Rural Institute, this webinar on postmodernism. Now, this is a time all of us are waiting for Dr. DORAIRAJ to enlighten us all to the different concepts and perspectives on postmodernism. Once again, I welcome you, Dr. DORAIRAJ.
Yes, I'm pleased to invite our principal, Dr. Joy Kale, to deliver the presidential address. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon and welcome. Dear academicians, professors, teachers, and all my beloved colleagues. It gives me a great pleasure that the Department of English organizes a national webinar on postmodernism. Dr. Joseph DORAIRAJ has always been a true friend of St. Thomas College, and I wholeheartedly thank Professor DORAIRAJ for the generosity and fraternity he has shown. I hope this webinar will give scope for a widened intellectual exercise on postmodernism. Let me extend affectionate wishes to everyone related to this webinar. Thank you, sir.
We're extremely proud to have Dr. Joseph DORAIRAJ as our resource person. He's an erudite scholar and a humane public speaker. Therefore, we are very sure that you would all benefit from his lecture. Sir, the floor is all yours. You can start your lecture, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Joy K.L., Principal of St. Thomas College, Thrissur. Dr. Anto Thomas, Head of the Department of English and Thomas College, Thrissur. Dr. Anil George, the IQAC Coordinator of St. Thomas College, Thrissur. Reverend Dr. K.A. Martin, Reverend Dr. Flergin, and Reverend Father Stishin, and the Faculty of English at St. Thomas College, Thrissur, and my own friends from Gandhigram Rural Institute, deemed university. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to all of you. As it was clarified by the principal of St. Thomas College, Thrissur, and also the head of the Department of English of St. Thomas College, Thrissur, this is a joint venture. This is a collaborative venture, a joint venture between the School of English and Foreign Languages, Gandhigram Rural Institute, deemed to be University Gandhigram, and the Department of English and IQAC, St. Thomas College, Thrissur. And I am sure this collaboration between these two institutions would grow, and I look forward to organizing not only webinars once we cross this crisis period after the pandemic. I am sure we would be organizing seminars as well, and I look forward to that. Now, dear participants, before I start my presentation on postmodernism, I would like to make a few things clear to you. What I'm going to talk about and what I'm going to skip. I think the transaction would be clearer if I spell out what is on my mind. Point number one, the title is What is Postmodernism? But please remember that I would be talking about modernism and postmodernism, not that I am going to exclude modernism, I would start with modernism. In fact, I would be spending the first 20 or 25 minutes talking about modernism. Then once I finish with modernism, I would switch over to postmodernism. So this is the first clarification that I would like to offer. Now, the second point is, I would like to talk about it elaborately. But then now, as a prelude, I would like to remind you that there are many versions of postmodernism. I repeat that there are many versions, many brands, many facets of postmodernism. So I would be focusing on one version of postmodernism. So which means we can have Eagleton's version of postmodernism, we can have Baudrillard's version of postmodernism, we can have Frederick Jameson's version of postmodernism. Now, I would not be talking about those versions or those brands of postmodernism. I would be focusing on Jean-Francois Lyotard's version of postmodernism. So I would like to make it very clear. Now, the third clarification is, in this webinar, during my presentation, I am not going to give you tips as to how to read and how to interpret a text from a postmodernist point of view. Maybe some students have this expectation that I would be giving them some tips, some heuristics, some theoretical methodology as to how to interpret maybe a novel or a poem or a drama or a short story from a postmodernist point of view. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that. Now, my focus would be literary philosophical perspective, and it is going to be largely theoretical. I underline it is going to be largely theoretical, but of course I would be talking from both a literary point of view and from a philosophical point of view. Okay, fine. So these are the points of clarification that I wanted to add right at the beginning so that the transaction is made more efficient once we know what we are in for. Now, ladies and gentlemen, my presentation, you please take a look at this slide. My presentation is divided into 4 units. In the first part, I would be answering 3 questions. What was modernism? What is literary modernism? And what is the connection between modernism on the one hand and modernity on the other? So these 3 questions and the answers would constitute the first part of my presentation. After talking about modernism, I would like to address the question, what is postmodernism? As I said earlier, largely from a literary and philosophical perspective. After having answered the question, what is postmodernism? Very briefly, I would like to talk about the postmodernist issues or trends in literature and with a few examples. Now, towards the end, the last part of my presentation would focus on how to resolve the conflict between the modernist worldview and the postmodernist worldview. So this roughly is the outline of my presentation. What was modernism? What is postmodernism? Postmodernism in literature and resolving the conflict between these 2 worldviews, modernist on the one hand and postmodernist on the other. Now, please take a look at this slide. I would like to answer this question, what was modernism? Now, the definition, there is a very short definition of modernism, and I have taken this definition of modernism from Peter Barry, Beginning Theory. I will come to this definition a little later. Now, please go down the screen, what is printed in blue. Okay, we are all sure of some statistical data. James Joyce's Ulysses, one of my favorite novels, and in fact it has been voted as the best novel of the 20th century by Random Publishing House. When was it published? It was published in 1922. Okay, we go to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. When was The Wasteland published? The Wasteland also was published in 1922. Then we go to 2 novels of Virginia Woolf, Jacob's Room. Now, Jacob's Room also was published in 1922, so which means 1922 is a very significant year as far as literature is concerned, because it was in 1922 that we had the publication of Joyce's Ulysses, Eliot's The Wasteland, and Virginia Woolf's Jacob's Room. Now, 5 years after that, that is in 1927, Virginia Woolf came out with another revolutionary novel with the title To the Lighthouse. And in 1919, Virginia Woolf wrote an essay with the title Modern Fiction. I will talk about the significance of this particular essay a little later. Now, so far we have been talking about literature. So from literature, we will move to painting. André Breton, the French poet and critic, he brought out the Manifesto on Surrealism, and it was in the year 1924. And from painting, we will move on to sculpture and once again painting. So Picasso's Guernica was unveiled in 1937. Now, some of the students may be wondering, I have been reeling off a lot of data, which novel was published in which year, which essay was published in which year, when did André Breton bring out his manifesto or surrealism, or when was Picasso's Guernica unveiled? Now, I am sure you would notice two facts. You would deduce two facts. Number one, something significant was happening in the 1920s. Okay, so because we have the publication of Ulysses, the publication of The Wasteland, the publication of Jacob's Room. So all these happen in the 1920s. Now, if we extend the frontiers, instead of one particular decade, the 1920s, we can include the first half of the 20th century. So which means the first thing, let us be clear about the time frame. Okay, so we have two answers. Answer number one, in Europe, when I say Europe, I am also talking of the Anglo-American world. So in Europe, in UK, in the USA, something significant was happening in the 1920s, or if we want to have a little broader framework, something significant, something revolutionary, something innovative was happening in the first half of the 20th century. Now let us go back to the question. What was happening in the 1920s, or what was happening in the first half of the 20th century? Okay, now let us go to the definition of modernism, and this definition of modernism, I have picked it from Peter Barry's beginning theory. So Barry would define modernism as the aesthetic movement, not only literary but also aesthetic. I repeat, not only literary but also aesthetic, the aesthetic or the artistic movement which dominated the arts and culture of the 1920s or the first half of the 20th century. So this in fact is a precise definition of modernism. And please note the first sentence and the second sentence, something was happening in the field of literature, not only in the field of literature, but also in the field of arts, which means we go to the second slide. What was modernism? Okay, look at the second bullet. Modernism was a multifaceted phenomenon. It was not only a multifaceted phenomenon, it was a pan-European movement. Now, what do I mean by multifaceted or a multidimensional phenomenon? Okay, I'll give you some examples. I'll give you some answers. Something was happening in the field of literature. I have already given you the examples of James Joyce, T.S. Eliot and others. Something was happening in the field of painting. You go to the Impressionists, you go to the Post-Impressionists, you go to Dadaists, Salvador Dali, you go to sculpture, something was happening. You go to music, something was happening. So which means something significant was happening in a lot of areas, not only in the field of literature, but in related areas, in music, in painting, in sculpture, in architecture. So therefore, we call modernism a multifaceted or a multidimensional phenomenon. Now, who were the people involved in modernism? It was not just artists from UK and the USA. In fact, we have a lot of artists from Europe. So if you want me to give some examples from the United States of America, we have Ezra Pound and also T.S. Eliot, who will also figure when we talk about the British experts as far as modernism is concerned. Then we have Virginia Woolf, and if you cross UK and then if you go to Ireland, we have Samuel Beckett, and once we cross Ireland and then we come to Europe, we have Kafka, who is a German. We have Stravinsky, who is a Russian composer. We have Dali, a Spanish painter. We have Picasso, we have a Spanish painter and a Spanish sculptor. We have André Breton, who was a French poet and critic. So therefore, we need to underline that modernism was a multifaceted phenomenon. It was not confined to literature. It was a literary phenomenon, plus it was an artistic phenomenon. And who were the people who were involved in modernism? Not just the Britishers and the Americans, but a whole lot of Europeans were involved. So that is why modernism is called a multifaceted phenomenon and a pan-European movement. Now, I have been using this adjective significant, something significant happened. Okay, so what exactly happened in the field of literature and in the field of arts? Now, if you look at the first bullet, that makes it very clear: innovation and experimentation. Okay, so what was happening with regard to James Joyce's Ulysses or T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, or the writings of Kafka, or the music of Stravinsky, or the paintings of Picasso or Salvador Dali? What was happening? Innovation and experimentation. I will be talking about a little later. Now go to the three bullets marked in red. Now, what was the manifesto, or what was the slogan, or what was the credo of modernism? In fact, we have two slogans. Okay, one was given to us by Ezra Pound. So he says, the credo of modernism is new, make it new. In other words, innovate, experiment. And Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher known for his critiques, he has written an essay with the title Answering the Question, What is Enlightenment? So talking about the credo or the manifesto of modernism, Immanuel Kant announced it is sapere aude, German meaning day to know. So in other words, modernism is something to do with innovation. It has got something to do with experimentation. I'll be talking a little more about it in the next slide. Now, having defined what modernism is, I would like to talk about Paleo-modernism and Neo-modernism, and I would also like to throw light on high modernism and low modernism. Now, these two distinctions have been made by Harry Levin. He wrote an article called What Was Modernism? And you find this article in the book Refraction. So this is by Harry Levin, the American comparativist scholar. So he talks of Paleo-modernism on the one hand and New Modernism on the other. I'll give you two examples. Now you take T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, or you take James Joyce's Ulysses. Now, as far as the style is concerned, as far as the organization is concerned, as far as the presentation is concerned, it is innovative, it is experimental, daringly innovative and daringly experimental. But at the same time, it is paleo, it is old, it is traditional. In what sense is it paleo? In what sense is it traditional? As far as the techniques are concerned, it is modernist, it is innovative, it is experimental. But then if you take the theme, it is from Greek mythology. It is an old theme, so therefore it is called paleo. So two types of modernism according to Harry Levin: Paleo-modernism, and the best example would be Joyce's Ulysses, and Neo-modernism. Neo-modernism, you take the novels of Virginia Woolf. The content is modern and the presentation also is modern. Now, Harry Levin would talk of another distinction, namely high modernism on the one hand and low modernism on the other. Now, T.S. Eliot would be a very good example of high modernism. Virginia Woolf would be a very good example of high modernism. James Joyce would be a good example of high modernism, and James Joyce would also be an example of low modernism. So what is low modernism? Low modernism is obscenity. All of you know that Ulysses was once banned. It had to go to the court. There was a long drawn out case because of obscenity. Then they revoked the ban. So what is high modernism? Eliot, for instance, he would come under the category of high modernism. Now, James Joyce's Ulysses, it can be given as an example of high modernism, and at the same time it can be given as an example of low modernism because there are certain obscene passages. But if you want a better example of low modernism, I suggest that you look up the internet for some of the letters that Joyce wrote to his wife Nora Barnacle in the year 1909. I mean, you can find out how many times he has used the F word and how obscene it is. So this is something about Paleomodernism and Neo-Modernism, High Modernism and Low Modernism. Now from literature, I would like to go off into the realm of painting. Now, if you look at the right side of your screen, you will find two paintings. I am sure most of you are able to identify these two paintings. Now, the first painting is by Claude Monet, the French painter. It is called Impression, and that is why we have the school of painting known as Impressionism. And the second one, I am sure most of you must have guessed, it is by the famous Dutch painter Van Gogh. It is called The Starry Sky. Okay, now Claude Monet, the French painter, he is the prime example of Impressionism, and Van Gogh would be a very good example of Post-Impressionism, which means, as I said earlier in my first slide, when we talk of modernism, we should not confine ourselves, we should not restrict ourselves to literature. We should embrace other areas as well, particularly painting, because modernism in painting is very closely associated with modernism in literature. And when we talk of painting, please look at the second line. We have three schools. In fact, the three schools could even be converted into four schools. We have Impressionism, we have Post-Impressionism, we have Surrealism, and we have Cubism. Now, who are the Impressionists? Okay, so there are many Impressionists. I would be talking of three people: Claude Monet, Jean Renoir, and Sisley. So Monet was French, Renoir also was French, Sisley was British. Then we have the Post-Impressionists. We have Paul Cézanne, French, Van Gogh, Dutch, Gauguin, and Seurat. Okay, so the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists. Okay, now you look at these two paintings. The first one, as I said, it is by Claude Monet. It is called Sunrise, and this marked the era of Impressionism. And the second one is by Van Gogh, and this is supposed to be a significant example of Post-Impressionism. Now you look at these two paintings and imagine, I want you to visualize some of the paintings of, let us say, Raphael or Da Vinci or Michelangelo or Titian or Botticelli, called the Renaissance painters, and what would be the important or the significant differences. Now please go to the screen. Characteristics of both Impression and Post-Impressionism. Okay, now you look at the painting by Van Gogh. Okay, now the brush strokes are visible, thick visible brush strokes. Now you go to the Renaissance painters, particularly Titian and others. Okay, they have a studio, then they have a model and they paint. But whereas in the case of the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, they go out into the open. So they are open compositions. The emphasis is on light and is changing quality. Then they take up ordinary subject matter, something like sunrise, something like Van Gogh has another painting, sunflowers. Van Gogh has yet another painting called Potato Eaters. So ordinary people, then the illusion of movement, unusual visual angles and bright colors. In other words, the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists, the Surrealists and the Cubists, they question the solidity of the real world and the reliability of perception. In other words, what happened was, I'll summarize my first three slides. What happened was, in my first slide, I referred to the essay by Virginia Woolf, Modern Fiction. Now, this is supposed to be an illuminating essay, and this would give you the theoretical basis or the theoretical justification not only for modernist literature, but for modernist art. In other words, what exactly happened in modernist literature, modernist painting, modernist sculpture, modernist music? Okay, a break with the past, innovation, experimentation. In other words, Virginia Woolf in her essay Modern Fiction makes it very clear. How does the mind work? The mind does not work in a linear chronological fashion. Now, if I ask somebody, how was yesterday? What did you do yesterday? The person will not start, okay, evening 7 o'clock I did this. Night 9:30 I did this. No, you would expect a linear account, a chronological account. Okay, 6 o'clock I got up, 7 o'clock I did this, 9 o'clock I did this, 12 o'clock I did this, 2 o'clock I had my lunch, then I had a siesta, 4 o'clock I had my tea. So in which means you look at traditional narratives, they are linear, they are chronological in organization. This is realist literature, this is traditional narratives. Now, Virginia Woolf makes it very clear in her essay Modern Fiction, particularly in the second part of the essay, she makes it clear. The human mind does not work in a linear fashion. The human mind does not work in a chronological fashion. Instead, she said, at any given time, thousands of atoms fall on my consciousness, thousands of atoms impinge on my consciousness. But if I were to present everything, then you will not have any linearity, you will not have any chronology. It will be stream of consciousness. In other words, it is impressionistic. Impressionistic not in the negative sense, because we have two very famous essays, the intentional fallacy and the affective fallacy. The affective fallacy would be criticism based on mere impressions, not on solid facts, not on solid interpretations, but on mere facts. So I am not talking of that impressions. Impressions here would mean how I perceive. In other words, there was an epistemological break, not how the world is, but how the world appears to me. And this was the most significant dimension of modernist painting. Now, having talked about what is modernism, I would like to make a very brief comparison between modernism on the one hand and modernity on the other. Straight away, I would like to clarify that these are not one and the same, and there is a vital difference between modernism on the one hand and modernity on the other. As I spelled out a little earlier, modernism was something literary and aesthetic, whereas modernity was philosophical. I would like to give you two short quotations. One is from Klager. She has written a very good book, Literary Theory for the Perplexed. She makes it very clear, modernism generally refers to the broad aesthetic movements of the 20th century. Look at the word aesthetic. It is literary, it is artistic, it is aesthetic. Whereas modernity refers to a set of philosophical, political and ethical ideas which provide the basis for the aesthetic aspect of modernism. Now, Madan Sarup, he is in UK, he is a professor in UK. He has written a very good book, an introductory book to post-structuralism and postmodernism. So there is a chapter on Lyotard and postmodernism. There he writes, modernity is that cluster of social, economic and political system brought into being in the West from somewhere around the 18th century onwards. So which means, at the risk of summarizing, I would say modernism is something to do with literature, something to do with arts, whereas modernity is something philosophical. Now, in order to have a better understanding of what exactly modernity is, we need to take a look at this. Now, you look at Western history, you look at European history, how do we divide, how do we carve up European history? Now, when we talk of the different phases or the different periods in European history, Western history, we talk of antiquity, then we talk of Dark Ages, we talk of Middle Ages, the medieval period that was roughly from 1000 to 1500. Then we talk of modernity that was from 1500 to 1789. Now, Middle Ages. Now, the Middle Ages spanning 500 years, from 1000 to 1500 years, it was also known as the Age of Faith. In other words, all authority and all power was vested with the church. It was the age of faith. Now, what happened? Modernity wanted to break this spell. So therefore, they said modernity, also known as the age of Renaissance, also known as the age of Enlightenment. What did the Enlightenment say? if humankind has to proceed, has to advance, don't believe in God, don't believe in religion, don't believe in prayers, instead believe in yourself and believe in reason. Okay, and when we talk of modernity, we also have the birth of modern philosophy, starting with René Descartes and also Francis Bacon, Novum Organum, and Descartes' Meditations. Okay, then we talk of enlightenment. So when we talk of modernity, modernity is very specifically associated with enlightenment. Okay, so enlightenment roughly from 1688, the bloodless revolution, to 1789, the French Revolution. So the Enlightenment. Okay, so the Enlightenment, the word is very positive, but it was not a very positive phenomenon. It was a positive as well as a strongly negative phenomenon. So the Enlightenment, in fact, I would even say it is a misnomer, because it was not truly positive. There were negative dimensions, there were negative shades. So the Enlightenment was associated with modernity. What exactly happened during the Enlightenment? So you please take a look at this slide. If I can summarize this slide would argue, as I said, the Middle Ages were also known as the age of faith, because power was in the hands of the church. Now, modernity wanted to break this concentration of power in the church. So they said, if humanity had to produce, there is no point believing in God, believing in religion. Instead, you believe in yourselves, you believe in reason. And another word for reason would be science. I'm sure nobody will argue against this. I'm sure all of us would agree to this thesis or hypothesis that reason is the ultimate judge. Reason or science is the ultimate paradigm. We do not have any quarrel with this. But where did the problem begin? The problem began in a very subtle way. The European tradition is rational or scientific, and the non-European cultures are non-rational or non-scientific. In other words, it was us and them. So the othering started. In post-colonialism, we talk about the other. So the othering started here. Only the Western civilization, only the white man's culture, only the white man's civilization, that was based on reason. That was based on science. All other cultures, all other civilizations, all other traditions, they were not based on science. They were not based on reason. So it was rational versus irrational, scientific versus non-scientific. So the process of inferiorizing, the otherizing started here. And as we all know, this became the theoretical basis for colonization. And let me go to this particular slide. Now, so far I have been talking of what was modernism and what was the distinction between modernism and modernity. Now, very briefly, I want to give you an example of modernism with reference to literature. I'm sure at least a sizable percentage of you have read James Joyce's Ulysses. As I said earlier, supposed to be the best novel of the 20th century. Now, this is the last page. I would not say the last paragraph, because it is a paragraph which runs to 40 pages, 40 odd pages. Okay, so the best example of the stream of consciousness technique. And how does the novel end? The novel ends with many yeses. Okay, so Molly Bloom's Reverie. So this would be a very good example of modernist literature, the last page of James Joyce's Ulysses. And this would be my last slide as far as the first point of my presentation is concerned. So I would be summarizing the aspects or the qualities or the characteristics of literary modernism. So there are some 6 points. The first one, so break with linear chronological narrative. I have already given you this example. What do we mean by linearity in narrative? So you take To the Lighthouse or James Joyce's Ulysses. Okay, so they are very good examples of disruption of linear and chronological narratives. And in the place of linear and chronological narratives, we have a discontinuous and a spatial narrative. Then you go to the next point. Emphasis on impressionism and subjectivity. It is in this context that I talked of Claude Monet and Vincent van Gogh, the impressionist painters, who made it very clear We are not interested in phenomena as such, but we are interested in how those phenomena appear to us, our impressions of whether it is a sunflower or a starry sky or a starry night or potato eaters or sunrise. So impressionism and subjectivity, how we see rather than what we see. Then there is a focus on experimentation and innovation, and rejection of elaborate formal aesthetics in favor of minimalist designs, and a tendency towards reflexivity or self-consciousness, which we will also find in postmodernism, particularly with reference to Patricia Waugh. She has written a book with the title Metafiction. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I have taken a lot of time. So this was the first part of my presentation. I have answered 3 questions. What was modernism? A literary and an artistic phenomenon that took place in Europe in the 1920s or in the first half of the 20th century. And I also spelt out the characteristics of literary modernism. And I also clarified the distinction between modernism on the one hand and postmodernity on the other. Now let me move on to the second part of my presentation, which is an important section. So here I would talk of what is postmodernism. So please take a look at this slide. Okay, please take a look at this photograph. I am not sure if you are able to read the caption. Maybe in your mobile it is tiny. Okay, so I'm sure you are able to make out some building is demolished. Okay, I'm sure this is very clear. This is obvious. Not just one building. Okay, a whole lot of buildings are demolished. They are destroyed. They are dynamited. So we have 2 questions. What are these buildings and why are these buildings demolished or dynamited? Now let me reframe my question. When was postmodernism born? Now some of you may be wondering what is the connection between these 2 questions, because the earlier question was what building is this and why was it destroyed? Now the second question is, it looks like it is totally at odds with the earlier question. When was postmodernism born? Okay, postmodernism was born. I mean, don't laugh, take it with a pinch of salt. So postmodernism, according to Jenks. Okay, so who is Jenks? Jenks is an American. He is an American postmodernist architect. So according to Jenks, postmodernism was born on 15th July 1972. He could have stopped there, but he went further and then he said at 3:32 in the afternoon. Okay, so whose statement is this? It is Jenks. Okay, Charles Jenks, an American postmodernist architect. Okay, so now we have 3 questions. What buildings are these? Why were these buildings demolished or dynamited? And when was postmodernism born? Okay, now I will answer these 3 questions. Now the third question has already been answered by Jenks, because he said postmodernism was born on 15th July 1972 at 3:32 p.m. Now let me go to the first 2 questions. Okay, what are these buildings and why were these buildings dynamited? Now 9/11. Okay, so what strikes your mind? I am sure when you talk of 9/11, I am sure you are able to visualize the horrible scenes of the Twin Towers being bombed and ultimately razed to the ground. Okay, I'm not going to ask you who did that. Instead, I'm going to ask you who was the architect. I know it is a very difficult question because we are all students of literature, not students of engineering or architecture. Okay, who had designed the Twin Towers? Okay, now it was, I'm sure maybe some of you know the answer. It was a 2nd generation Japanese American called Yamasaki. It was a 2nd generation Japanese American called Yamasaki. He was the architect of the Twin Towers, and please remember it was Yamasaki who had designed the Twin Towers in New York. He was the one who had designed these towers which you see on the screen being demolished, being dynamited. So Yamasaki, Minoru Yamasaki, 2nd generation Japanese American, he was the architect. Now this building is known as Pruyu Ego Housing Scheme. Okay, so what is this Pruyu Ego housing scheme? It is a combination of the Wendell O. Pruyi homes and William Igo apartments together called Pruyu Ego, and these houses, they do not exist anymore because they have been dynamited, razed to the ground, and so they do not exist anymore. But at that time, they were in St. Louis, Missouri, United States of America. So this was an urban housing scheme promoted by the government of the United States of America. And as I said earlier, the architect was Yamasaki. Okay, so I have answered the first question. What are these buildings? So these buildings are Pruyo Yugo apartments in St. Louis, Missouri, United States of America, and the architect, the one who had designed these buildings, were the famous architect Yamasaki, who had also designed the Twin Towers. Now let us go to the second question. Why were these buildings dynamited? Okay, so there's a long story, but I'll give the answer in 2 sentences. These buildings, or this Pruyi Igo housing scheme at St. Louis, Missouri, these buildings were dynamited for 2 reasons. They stood as examples of the American government's inefficiency. Therefore, they were destroyed, therefore they were dynamited. But anyway, that is not our concern now, because we are not talking of government policies, we are talking of postmodernism. Okay, so the second reason is people were very, very unhappy with the architecture, with the style. And what was the architecture? What was the style? This could be construed, this could be looked upon as an example of modernist architecture. Okay, so we talk of modernist architecture, you're looking for some example, you're looking for some significant example. So this housing project, this urban housing project designed by a very famous architect known as Yamasaki, this could be construed, this could be taken as one of the outstanding examples of modernist architecture. But people were very unhappy with the way these buildings had been designed. In other words, they were very discontented or unhappy with modernist architecture. That was the reason these buildings were pulled down, these buildings were dynamited. So which means there were 3 questions. What are these buildings? Why are they razed to the ground? And a related question, when was postmodernism born? Okay, so these buildings, an urban housing project promoted by the government of the United States of America, and the architect was Yamasaki. These buildings were dynamited, destroyed, because people were very unhappy with modernist architecture. We have to ask a question, what was wrong with modernist architecture? I will come to that a little later. And when was postmodernism born? So which means the moment these buildings were dynamited or destroyed or razed to the ground, so which means, if I can put it a little metaphorically, on the ashes of modernist architecture, postmodernism was born, and this was the version according to Jenks. Now let me ask this question, what was wrong with modernist architecture? They give a lot of reasons. One is it was purist, it was exclusivist, it was universalistic, it was rational, it was bare. In other words, I'll give you 2 quotations, 2 short quotations. Now, the modernist architecture, they had a group. Please look at the slide. The second line, it is called Bauhaus. They had a school of architecture. It was Bauhaus, and it was inspired by 3 people. Gropius, who was a German, Corbusier, who was French and Swiss, and Van der Rohe, who was an American and German. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Corbusier, because in India, people say Chandigarh is the most beautiful city because it was planned. It was planned and built, and Corbusier was the architect. Anyway, now I'll give you 2 quotations. Van der Rohe, okay, he said, less is more. In other words, minimalist. And Corbusier said, a house is a machine for living in. In other words, this happened immediately after the Second World War, and a lot of former soldiers, a lot of veterans were looking for houses, and they needed to be accommodated, and these houses had to come up very fast. There was no time for ornamentation. There was no time for decoration. So something functional, something bare. If I can think of an Indian example, you think of any government hospital, it looks bare, it looks empty with a yellow shade. Okay, so that was wrong with modernist architecture. So according to Jenks, in fact, there are two American architects, Jenks and Venturi. So according to Jenks, postmodernism was born on 15th July 1972 at 3:32 p.m. In other words, when modernist architecture was destroyed, postmodernist architecture began. So which means just like modernism, postmodernism also was a multifaceted phenomenon, and postmodernism originally began in architecture. I repeat, it started with architecture and then it spread to other fields. Now please take a look at this slide. I will not spend much time. So the first photograph talks about the three distinct styles of architecture. We have the classical style. Particularly if you go to Rome, you would find a lot of buildings like this. I have not been to Greece, but I have been to Rome. So you find a lot of buildings like this with columns. Okay, so that would be classical architecture. So the second one would be modern architecture. It is not at all appealing. It looks bare, short of any frills, short of any ornamentation. And you have the postmodern style, which combines the classical version and the modern version. So therefore it is eclectic. Now at the bottom of your screen, you have two very good examples of postmodernist architecture. And ladies and gentlemen, I am sure you are able to identify the two pictures or the two photographs. Now to your left, I'm sure you have been to, I'm sure at least some of you have been to Paris, the Louvre Museum, which houses the famous painting of Mona Lisa. So the glass pyramid is at the entry of Louvre Museum. And this glass pyramid is supposed to be one of the finest examples of postmodernist architecture. Now, if you move over to the other side of the screen, you have another very famous example of postmodernist architecture, that is the Sydney Opera House at Sydney Harbour, Sydney. And these two would be very good examples of postmodernist architecture. I will not spend much time talking about this. Now let us try to define postmodernism, because earlier we defined modernism as an artistic movement that took place in the first half of the 20th century. So how do we define postmodernism? Okay, so I would be referring to Lyotard's book, The Postmodern Condition, a Report on Knowledge. But before I actually refer to the definition of postmodernism according to Lyotard, I would like to give you some background. Now what happened was, somewhere in the 1970s, the Council of Universities of the government of Quebec, all of us know that in Canada they speak two languages. We have the English speaking Canadian province and the French speaking Canadian province. So this was Quebec. The Council of Universities of the government of Quebec, they wanted to launch, they wanted to undertake an international survey, and the prime objective of the survey was to find out the status of knowledge the world over. So at the global level, at the international level, what is knowledge and how is knowledge rated? What kind of knowledge is accepted by people, appreciated by people? So they wanted to launch an international survey, and this survey was entrusted to a French political philosopher called Jean-Francois Lyotard, and he did this project. And as we all know, if you do a project, you have to, at the end of the project, you have to submit the report. So the original report was in French and it was submitted in 1979. And the English translation appeared in 1984 and it was published by Manchester University Press. And the English title would be The Postmodern Condition, a Report on Knowledge. Now, before I go to the definition of postmodernism according to Lyotard, what was the major finding of this international survey? Because I said a short while ago, the objective, the aim of this international survey was to find out the status of knowledge. Now, what kind of knowledge was accepted by people, was deemed superior by people? Okay, so he came up with the answer. It was science and the language of science. Now, what do we mean by the language of science? As we all know, the language of science is denotational. I mean, as students of literature, we are all very familiar with an outstanding essay by I.A. Richards called The Two Kinds of Language. He talks about the referential type of language, and he also talks of the emotive kind of language, the language of science and the language of poetry. The language of science is denotational and the language of poetry is connotational. So Lyotard found out that it is denotational language that rules the world, and he didn't stop there. He added, science does not tolerate any other form of language other than denotation. So which means, what about myth? What about magic? What about fable? What about poetry? So science does not tolerate the language of these narratives. Why? Because they are not denotational. Anyway, this is for us to think. Now let me go to the definition of postmodernism. So this is a very short book, 120 pages or so. Then the writer's preface running to 3.5 pages, and the introduction was given by America's foremost postmodernist critic Frederick Jameson. Now towards the end of the writer's preface, Lyotard comes up with this definition of postmodernism. He writes, simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to focus on these three terms: incredulity toward meta-narrative. Incredulity, if you want a simpler word, suspicion or distrust, or if you want a strong word, death. Okay, so what is postmodernism? Death of meta-narratives, so suspicion towards meta-narratives. Okay, meta-narratives, if you're not very comfortable with the term meta-narrative, we can think of a grand narrative or an overarching narrative or a totalizing narrative. Okay, fine. So what is postmodernism? Postmodernism as announced or postmodernism as declared death of meta-narrative. So which means we need to ask two questions. Why did postmodernism announce or declare the death of meta-narratives? What is wrong with the meta-narrative? What is wrong with the grand narrative? So this is the first important question that we need to answer. The second important question that we need to address is, in the place of meta-narratives, what kind of narratives are promoted? So what is the substitute? What is the alternative? Okay, now please go to the next slide. Okay, the next slide is not in, I will, since I'm running short of time, I will skip this slide. I have very briefly talked about the connection between modernism and postmodernism, and I have taken the help of Linda Hudson, Andreas Hussein and Lyotard. Now the argument is very simple. The argument is threefold. Yes, there is a connection between modernism and postmodernism. No, there isn't a connection between modernism and postmodernism. And the third point is, don't worry whether there is a connection or no connection between modernism and postmodernism. Don't get stuck in the either or position. So that is the key idea in this particular slide. And in this particular slide, I would like to talk of what is post in postmodernism. Is it a period marker or an aesthetic style? Okay, so anyway, I'll skip this also. Now this is an important slide. Now I have not forgotten the two questions that I have raised. What are the two questions? What is wrong with a meta-narrative that we need to announce or talk about the death of grand narratives, and what is the substitute or what is the alternative to meta-narratives? Okay, so I have not forgotten those two questions. After this slide, I will answer these two questions. Now this is an important slide. Now, how do you look at postmodernism? We can look at postmodernism from 2 points of view, from two perspectives. A narrow perspective would talk of postmodernism as the death of a as the death or the demise of a meta-narrative or a grand narrative. But from a larger perspective, we can talk of postmodernism as an umbrella term which subsumes or which includes post-structuralism, post-colonialism and post-feminism. How? I will explain this shortly. Now, if you define postmodernism as an attack on a grand narrative, then what we do is post-structuralism also launches an attack on a grand narrative. Post-colonialism also launches an attack on a grand narrative, and feminism also launches an attack on a grand narrative. In that sense, there is common ground. So therefore, all these could be considered postmodernists in some sense or the other. Okay, so post-structuralism attacks traditional Western metaphysics. So the grand narrative that is attacked by Derrida and deconstruction and post-structuralism is traditional Western metaphysics, in particular phonocentrism and logocentrism. So therefore, in that sense, post-structuralism is also postmodernism. Now, what does post-colonialism attack? It attacks a grand narrative called Eurocentrism. So in that sense, on that count, it is another version of postmodernism. And what does feminism attack? It attracts a grand narrative called patriarchy. And in that sense, feminism also is another version or an extension of postmodernism. Now let me come to an important slide, because I have raised two questions. We have Lyotard has defined postmodernism as the death of a meta-narrative, or as the death of a grand narrative, or the death of a totalizing narrative. So therefore, two questions. What is wrong with a meta-narrative? What is wrong with a grand narrative? And what is the substitute, or what is the alternative to a meta-narrative or a grand narrative? So I will answer these two questions in this slide and in the following slide. Now let me give you two examples. I'm sure as academics, not only as academics, as human beings, I'm sure all of us believe in feminism. Okay, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're an Indian or a non-Indian, whether you belong to this religion or that religion. Okay, all of us believe in feminism, maybe the degree in which we believe. Okay, so that may vary. Okay, anyway, let us not talk of it. Now the question is there one feminism that is relevant and applicable to the entire world? Now the answer would be, I'm sure no, because the feminism that is relevant to the New York situation is definitely not relevant to the New Delhi situation, is definitely not relevant to the Thrissur situation, is definitely not relevant to the Gandhigram situation, because the local context is different. So there cannot be one feminism for the entire world. So therefore it is not feminism in the singular, it is feminisms in the plural. I'll give you one more example. Now in post-colonialism, we talk of English. Now earlier when we were students, we were taught English, the British variety or the RP received the pronunciation. But today post-colonialism says, why do you still want to speak the language of the colonial masters? Okay, you can speak English in your own way. You can speak English in the Malayalam accent. You can speak English with a Tamil accent. You can speak English with a Kannada accent. So that is why we talk of Hinglish and Manglish and Tanglish. So it is not English, it is Englishes. So in other words, what was the first question? What is wrong with a meta-narrative that we need to talk of the death of a meta-narrative? The answer is, it is totalizing. What is totalizing? I have one more slide. Okay, so what is wrong with a meta-narrative? What is wrong with a grand narrative? It is totalizing. Now, what is the negative side or the negative implications or the negative ramifications of totalizing or totalization? Okay, where there is totalization or where there is totality in the philosophical sense, there is no plurality, there is no heterogeneity, there is only one version, there is only one reality, there is only one truth. Okay, so that is why Lyotard announces or proclaims or declares the death of a meta-narrative, because it is totalizing. It does not admit plurality, it does not admit heterogeneity, it does not admit a variety, it does not admit many perspectives, many standpoints, many viewpoints. It has only one perspective: homogeneity. Okay, so now you look at the last bullet. So I had raised two questions. What is wrong with a meta narrative, that we need to talk of the death of a meta narrative, and once we proclaim the death of a meta narrative, what takes its position? So what is the substitute, or what is the alternative to meta narratives? We have mini narratives, and mini narratives are also known as provincial narratives or little narratives. When we talk of Thrissur feminism, when we talk of Gandhigram feminism, when we talk of Pudukkottai feminism, when we talk of Varanasi feminism, these would be mini narratives, taking the local context into consideration. Okay, so which means, what is a meta narrative and what is a mini narrative, and why are meta narratives dangerous? So I have explained all these in this particular slide. So what is wrong with a meta narrative? They smother, they crush difference, opposition, and plurality in the name of unity and homogenization. There should be only one voice, there should be only one culture, everybody should think in this particular way. No opposition, no dissent, no difference. Then it is wrong, it is suicidal. So that is why we need to announce, declare the death of meta narrative, because it smothers, it crushes difference, opposition, and plurality. Whereas mini narratives, which are provisional, contingent, and temporary, they provide the basis for the action of specific groups. So wherever there is no dissent, wherever there is no questioning, wherever there is no plurality, wherever there is no heterogeneity, there is only terror, because Lyotard himself has talked about it, Linda Hutchian has talked about it, and Adorno and Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, all these people have talked about totality is not very far from totalitarianism. When a ruler says there can be no dissent, when a ruler says nobody can talk against me, then what happens? It is totalitarianism, it is Stalinism, it is Nazism. I'm sure you agree with me. Now, what is totalization from a philosophical point of view? I will explain it with an example. Now, in the Indian tradition, all of us are very familiar with the story of the elephant and the 5 blind men, 5 visually challenged men. I will use it to highlight what is totality or what is totalization, and also the dangers of totalization. Okay, now what happened? The 5 visually challenged men were brought into a room, and an elephant also was brought into the room, and these 5 visually challenged men, each one was asked to describe the elephant. So the first one, he felt the leg of the elephant and he said, what did he say? Oh, I know how the elephant looks like. It looks like a pillar. The second one felt the body of the elephant and he said, oh, I know how the elephant looks like. It looks like a wall. The third one felt the tail of the elephant and he said, oh, I know how the elephant looks like. It is like a rope. Now the question is, the first one who said the elephant is like a pillar, was he right or was he wrong? The second one who said the elephant is like a wall, was he right or wrong? Now, dear friends, this is for us to think, this is for us to ponder over. Had the first man said a part of the elephant looks like a pillar, we would appreciate him, we would not have any quarrels with him. But then if he comes up with a proposition like, no, the whole elephant looks like a pillar, then of course we would laugh at him and we would say, no, that is not the truth, you're wrong. So which means this is philosophical totality. As human beings, we are finite, we are constricted by space and time. We are limited human beings, we are finite. So therefore, we have only a limited perspective of reality. Okay, so therefore, we need to have the humility to accept that we know only one part of reality, one small segment of reality. But then if we claim that that is the entire reality, that is totality, then we run into trouble, and that is philosophical totality or philosophical totalization. And look at the last 2 lines. Patricia was says, totalities are equated with totalitarianism and terror. Okay, now it is in this context that I would like to bring in the Austrian language philosopher Wittgenstein. Okay, now very briefly, when we talk of 20th century philosophy, we need to make a distinction between British philosophy on the one hand and European philosophy on the other. We are talking of 20th century philosophy. Now, 20th century British philosophy is largely language oriented and it is called analytic philosophy. Whereas in European philosophy, 20th century European philosophy, we have people like Camus, Kafka, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Sartre. All these people are existentialists. Okay, so their concerns are different from the British philosophers' concern. Now, this Wittgenstein, he was not a Britisher, he was an Austrian. Basically, he was an aeronautical engineer, but he worked with Bertrand Russell, who was a philosopher and who also won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Okay, and he has come up with two important publications. So one was published when he was alive during his lifetime. That book is called Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and after his death, Philosophical Investigations was published. Now, I want you to focus your attention on this called the language games, because any book, any article on postmodernism would definitely include a section on language games. So what is this language games? Question number one, and question number two, how are these language games applicable to the understanding of postmodernism? Okay, here is the book by Wittgenstein, Philosophical Investigations, a posthumous publication. So I have picked up two sentences from his book, Philosophical Publications, where he says, think of the tools in a toolbox. I'm sure all of us, particularly the men, I am sure in our own homes we have a toolbox, because something to be tightened, something to be unscrewed, something to be screwed. So all of us have a toolbox. So what do we have in the toolbox? There is a hammer, there is a plier, there is a saw, there is a screwdriver, there is a rule, there is this Fevicol, there is this nails, there's screws. Imagine somebody has a toolbox where he has only hammers, no other tool, or somebody else has a toolbox where there are only screwdrivers and nothing else. So which means a toolbox is made up of variety. Now he says you look at language. Okay, so this is where he talks of speech acts, the theory of J.L. Austin and Searle. They have talked of speech acts. Now in language, we have this constitutives, we have this performatives, we have this declaratives, we have these interrogatives. Now each sentence has its own rules. Or if I can give another example, we have one set of rules for basketball and another set of rules for football, and yet another set of rules for cricket or hockey. Okay, so these set of rules, one set of rules which are meant for basketball would not certainly apply to hockey or football. So what Wittgenstein wants to convey this is this particular word, incommensurable, meaning having no common standard, or to put it positively, plurality. Okay, so that is why I said any book on postmodernism or any article on postmodernism would certainly include a section on language games. And these language games, they are marked by plurality. So therefore, postmodernism is marked by plurality. And here is a quotation from Lyotard, where he argues that the criteria regulating the truth claims of knowledge derive from discrete, context-dependent language games, and certainly not absolute rules or standards. Okay, so dear friends, this is the last slide of the second part of my presentation. Okay, so in the second part of my presentation, I have answered two questions. What is postmodernism? How do we define postmodernism? And what is wrong with the meta narratives? Okay, so I would like to conclude the second part of my presentation with this slide, highlighting what is positive about postmodernism. There is something positive, there is something vibrant, there is something very good about postmodernism. What is positive about postmodernism? You look at the first four bullets. It is committed to dissent. It is committed to skepticism. It is committed to cultural differences. It is committed to pluralism, plurality. Okay. So the first part of my presentation, I talked about modernism. Second part of my presentation, I talked about postmodernism. Now in the third part, very briefly, I will not take more than 7 or 8 minutes. Postmodernism in literature. Okay, so in this particular slide, I have given the cover page of 3 outstanding postmodernist novels: Joseph Keller's Catch-22, Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, and Calvino's, who is an Italian author. Of course, the book has been translated into English, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. So I am sure you have read all the 3 books, or at least one of the books, and in case you do not have much exposure to postmodernist literature, so please read any one of these 3 novels. So that would be a very good starting point. I would suggest you start with Catch-22 because it is easy, and you also have the movie version. Gravity's Rainbow would be a little difficult. Maybe you can access it after having read Catch-22. Fine. Now I will not go into a detailed discussion of the postmodernist elements in literature. Okay, so this slide and the following slide, they talk about what are the postmodernist dimensions or aspects or features or characteristics in literature. I have got some 7 points. Now the first one, plurality of meaning, semiotic volatility leading to indeterminacy and plurality of meaning. So this is a statement made by Umberto Eco. So he says there are many meanings, and the best example that I can think of is you take Pynchon's novel V. What does V mean? There are unending explanations and interpretations. Even now people have not deciphered what V stands for. So in postmodernist texts, whether it is a novel or a short story or a film, we have plurality of meanings. Then what about the structure of the narrative? It is discontinuous and fragmentary. You think of Waiting for Godot, more than Waiting for Godot, you think of the other dramas of Beckett, particularly Endgame and the other dramas. Discontinuous and fragmentary narrative. As I said earlier, the traditional narrative is linear and chronological. But postmodernist literature, the narrative is not linear, it is not chronological, instead it is discontinuous and fragmentary. Now, modernist literature also was discontinuous. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland is discontinuous, and this trend is continued in postmodernist literature. Then you have multiple points of view, no omniscient narrative, and one of the best examples would be Fowles's The French Lieutenant's Wife. So multiple points of view, whereas in traditional novels, in realist novels, particularly with reference to George Eliot or Jane Austen or Thomas Hardy, we have the third person omniscient narrative, whereas here we have multiple points of view and therefore plurality. Then we have generic hybridity. Finnegan's Wake, what is Finnegan's Wake? Is it an epic? Is it a novel? Okay, so even now the debate continues. We are unable to arrive at a concrete answer because it is generic hybridity. We are not sure of the genre. Absence of a moral authorial center. The example would be Beckett's dramas. Then the presence of parody and pastiche. Okay, so pastiche is Jameson and parody would be Hutchian. I will talk about it a little later. Then celebratory tone as opposed to the ascetic tone of modernist literature. So there is fragmentation in modernist literature and postmodernist literature. But how do the modernists look at fragmentation? Because modernist literature comes immediately after the First World War. Postmodernist literature comes immediately after the Second World War. So in both cases, the world was not rosy. Okay, so because it was the post-war period. For the modernists, it was the post-war period after the First World War. For the postmodernists, it was the post-war period after the second post-war period. But how did they deal and how did they negotiate this fragmentation? Okay, in the case of modernists, particularly T.S. Eliot in his Wasteland, the tone is the tone of mourning, whereas postmodernists, they celebrate it. And the last one, and that the term in German, that is Heidegger's term, in der Wellswein, being in the world. They are not detached, they are not removed from the world, but they are in the world, being in the world. So these are some of the elements of postmodernist trends in literature. So there is one more slide which talks of the postmodernist trends in literature. The first one argues, okay, so this is taken from Peter Barry. Okay, so Peter Barry, the beginning theory, there is a chapter on postmodernism. So he talks of the various elements, the various features, the various characteristics of postmodernist literature. So I have borrowed these ideas from Peter Barry. The examples are mine. So the first point, according to Peter Barry, postmodernism, it mixes, it combines literary genres, and I have already given you the example of Finnegan's Wake. Then second point, Barry would argue postmodernist literature, it foregrounds, it emphasizes, it highlights intertextual elements, particularly parody, pastiche, and allusion. There is an exclusive slide on parody and pastiche, so therefore I will not offer any additional remarks. Then third point, according to Peter Barry, postmodernist literature, it foregrounds irony. You visit the past, but then you visit the past with irony. Then the fourth one, there are elements of narcissism, meaning the novel about itself, the novel talks about itself, the novel deals with itself, metafiction or surfiction. Okay, so the best example would be Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 1449 or Fowles's The French Lieutenant's Wife. And the last one, I have already talked about it. It challenges the distinction between high and low culture and highlights texts which work as hybrid blends of the two. Modernist, it was a superior attitude. High modernism, when someone asked T.S. Eliot, Mr. Eliot, why do you write such difficult poetry? He gave a very condescending reply. He says, my poetry is not meant to be a substitute for an after dinner cigar. Okay, so the supercilious attitude, the superior attitude. So that was high modernism, whereas postmodernism, if I am a postmodern, I would listen to Beethoven, Ninth Symphony, I would listen to Mozart, but I would also listen to rap. I would also listen to local folk music. So that is postmodernism. It does not make a distinction between the high variety and the low variety. Okay, now here is a slide on pastiche and parody. Pastiche is Frederick Jameson, and the same idea has been conveyed by Linda Hutcheon, parody. Now, what is this pastiche, or what is this parody, or what do we mean by the intertextual elements? Now, in the last 4 or 5 years, I am not sure of Malayalam film or Hindi film, at least in Tamil film, we have a lot of songs which are revisitations. An old song, okay, given in a modern garb. Okay, so the lyric is the same, the music is the same, okay, but maybe with a little difference. Okay, so a revisiting, okay, we call it remix. I'm sure you have it in other languages as well. Now that would be a very good example of pastiche or parody or intertextuality from a postmodernist point of view. In other words, we realize whatever we wanted to write, whatever we wanted to paint, whatever we wanted to sculpt have all been done already. So we have nothing new to do. So therefore what we would do is we would revisit the past and present it in a new manner. So that would be pastiche and parody. The only difference is Jameson talks of pastiche and Hutcheon talks of parody. In parody, there is a sting, there is an irony, whereas in pastiche, you please go to the last line, it is blank parody, parody that has lost its sense of humor. Okay, now this is the last slide regarding the third part of my presentation. So modernist literature versus postmodernist literature. So we have the writings of Eliot, the writings of Virginia Woolf, we have the writings of James Joyce. This is on the one side, and on the other side we have novelists like Pynchon. Even we have a novelist like Iris Murdoch, who is not strictly postmodernist, but some of her novels have postmodernist elements or dimensions in them. And we have Calvino, John Barth, literature of exhaustion. So modernist literature, postmodernist literature. Okay, so we have some points of convergence and we have some points of divergence. So the first one is both are multidisciplinary and both stress fragmentation. They stress fragmentation, but their attitude varies. In the case of the modernist writers, there is lamentation, whereas in the case of the postmodernist writers, they accept the given reality, and not that they rejoice, but they do not grumble. Okay, then we come to the third point. Modernist literature, it stems from a high culture, whereas postmodernism, It mixes, it is a medley, it is a hybrid variety, it is a celebration. So that is why I have given this example of postmodern pop culture. I'm sorry, I have typed it wrongly. It was not POL, it is POP, postmodern pop culture. A very good example would be rap music, African American. Then modernism was discursive, but postmodernism was more figural, more visual. Modernism does not mix up genres, but postmodernism revels in it. So dear friends, I have finished 3 parts of my presentation. In the first part, I answered the question, what was modernism? I used the past tense. In the second part, I talked about what is modernism. And in the third part, I talked about some of the elements of postmodernist literature. Let me go to the last part. I will not take more than 7 to 8 minutes. Now, the major question is, how do we resolve the worldview offered by modernism and the worldview offered by postmodernism? How do we resolve? Because there is a conflict between the meta narrative and the mini narrative. So how do we resolve this conflict? And this section will be largely philosophical. Okay. Now Rorty, you please look at the first line. Rorty, Richard Rorty, an American, and he is known for a particular brand of philosophy called pragmatism. And one of his major books, it is called Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. So he talks about very clearly the distinction between modernist philosophy, the worldview of modernist philosophy on the one hand, and the postmodern philosophy, and how it differs from modernist philosophy. Okay, so straight away he makes it clear. Straight away Richard Rorty makes it clear that modernist philosophy is constructive, it is foundational, and it is non-historical. Whereas postmodern philosophy, it is therapeutic, it is edifying, it is historicist, and it is hermeneutical. Okay, I'll explain these 2 terms. Then he says, please go to the last part of the presentation. The last part of the slide. Philosophy should be therapeutic to remind us of the illusory nature of our desire to attain knowledge that transcends limitations of history. Now, some of the terms, in what sense is modernist philosophy constructive, foundational, non-historical, and in what sense is postmodern philosophy therapeutic, edifying, historicist, and hermeneutical? Please hold on, I will answer these 2 questions with the help of this slide. Then I will go back. Now, postmodernism, as I have already talked about a little earlier with reference to mini narratives or little narratives or provincial narratives, postmodernism highlights, number 1, heterogeneity, plurality, and I have talked about what is the meaning of heterogeneity or plurality by bringing in language games of Wittgenstein. Okay, so he talks of the plurality of tools that we have in the toolbox. Similarly, language games, and I also gave this example how we have a set of rules for hockey and another set of rules for football. So there is variety, there is heterogeneity, there is plurality. Then anti-positivism. What is the meaning of anti-positivism? Positivism is one type of philosophy and sociology that was promoted by the sociologist called Auguste Comte, C-O-M-T-E, pronounced Comte. Now, what is the meaning of positivism? Positivism makes it very clear. Only that which is observable, only that which is empirical and available to us through the 5 senses, and of course reason and logic, only that can be counted. All that you imagine, all that you visualize, that cannot be taken into account. In other words, empirical and scientific and positivistic, only that is taken into consideration. Now, postmodernism is against positivism, therefore it is anti-positivism, and postmodernism is against foundationalism. What is foundationalism? Now, when we talk of foundationalism, we immediately refer to Aristotle and Descartes. I would refer to Descartes. Now, René Descartes, the French mathematician and philosopher, his major work is called Meditation. He made it very clear, I want my philosophy to be established or to be founded on something secure. And he used the word indubitable. There should not be any doubt whatsoever regarding the foundation of my philosophy. Okay, so after a lot of thinking and meditation and contemplation, he arrived at this proposition, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So that would be foundationalist thinking, whereas postmodernism is against all kinds of foundationalist thinking. So which means postmodernism is against homogeneity, postmodernism is against positivism, postmodernism is against foundationalism. Okay, so which means now let me go back to this particular slide. Now we can understand the first two sentences in a better way. So I said modernist philosophy is constructive, foundational and non-historical. What is the meaning of foundational? Foundational means searching for something secure on which you can pin your life, you can base your life, you can anchor your life. But unfortunately, no such foundation exists. So that is why postmodernism is against foundationalism, and modernist philosophy is non-historical. What is the meaning of non-historical? The implication or the ramification is you take it outside a particular context. So that is why, in contrast to modernist philosophy is foundational, postmodern philosophy is anti-foundational and edifying. Modernist philosophy is non-historical. Postmodernist philosophy is historicist because it argues human beings operate in a given situation, in a given environment. I have already referred to Heidegger's in the Wellsvein. Okay, so he is thrown into being, you are in a particular context, so you cannot claim to be outside history, non-historical. It is historicist. And finally, postmodernism argues it is hermeneutical. Hermeneutical means it is open to interpretation. Now, dear friends, I have given you an overview of postmodernism, not only from the point of view of literature, but also from the point of view of philosophy. Now, in order to get a complete picture, I have been talking of the positive side of postmodernism. I think some of you or most of you must be wondering, so this guy is an ardent advocate of postmodernism. Yes, I am an advocate of postmodernism. Why? Because it promotes plurality, it promotes dissent, it promotes different opinions, different perspectives. So I am on the side of postmodernism. But then in order to have a complete picture, you need to know the other side also. So we have four stringent or strident critics of postmodernism. Who are they and where can you find their arguments? So the first one is the German philosopher associated with the Frankfurt School, Jürgen Habermas. So he originally gave a lecture in Frankfurt, and the following year the same talk he delivered in New York and later converted it into an essay called Modernity, an Incomplete Project. So he is against people like Lyotard. Okay, so Habermas is against postmodernism. Then Hebdige. Who is Hebdige? Hebdige is a British sociologist who has written a lot on television, and his major book is on subculture. I'm sure it is available in your library. So he has written an essay. This is an essay called Postmodernism. On the other side, it was published in 1986. Then we have a philosopher who teaches at the University of Cardiff, Christopher Norris, and he has written a very good book on Derrida. The title itself is Derrida. So in 1990, he came up with a book called What is Wrong with Postmodernism, Critical Theory and Ends of Philosophy. Then finally we have our own Terry Eagleton, who has written a book with the title To the Illusions of Postmodernism, and that was published in 1996. Okay, so this would give you the complete picture, because these people, Habermas, Hebdige, Norris, Eagleton, okay, one is a philosopher, two are literary theorists, and the last one is a sociologist. Okay, so they would give the flip side of postmodernism, and that would constitute the entire picture. Okay, so this is my last slide. Okay, now I would like to leave this presentation with these three questions, these important questions. Now, whenever I talk about postmodernism, or when I read about postmodernism, or when I write about postmodernism, I would like to ask myself and my students some questions. Am I a postmodern? Meaning, do I have a pluralistic worldview? Is my family postmodern with a pluralistic outlook? Is my culture, is my religion, etc., postmodern with a pluralistic outlook? I am sure these are questions for us to answer. And finally, this is my last slide. I would like to give you a reading list. Maybe you don't have to read all the books, but I would give you some of the important books. So I am sure all of you are familiar with Peter Barry Beginning Theory. Okay, so there is a chapter on postmodernism. Okay, so this is beginning theory. So for the beginners, this is okay. Peter Barry Beginning Theory, the chapter on postmodernism. Now the next is a good book, but a difficult book. It is by Hans Bertens, The Idea of the Postmodern History. This is a difficult book, but it is worth investing time and energy because it talks of the idea of the postmodern and where does it come and how has it evolved. It is worth spending time on this book. Then you have a postmodernism reader, then you have Eagleton, you have Ehab Hassan, then Linda Hutcheon. I would refer this book, Linda Hutcheon, The Politics of Postmodernism, but I would, by all means, I want you to read, those of you who have not read this book, Lyotard, The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge. The French version was in 1979 and the English version 1984. The book is easily available, only 120 pages. And the next two books I would strongly recommend. Klages, okay, A Literary Theory, A Guide for the Perplexed. This is a very good book, not only for postmodernism, for post-structuralism, for feminism, for humanism. So this is a book on literary theory, and there are individual chapters talking about various isms and various theories. So the section on postmodernism is extremely good. The next book is an extremely good book by an Indian teaching in the UK, Madan Sarup, An Introductory Guide to Post-Structuralism and Postmodernism. The next is a collection of essays, a good one, Stuart Sim, Routledge Companion to Postmodernism. Then of course we have Patricia Wall's an edited volume, Postmodernism, a reader. Then the last book is Tim Booth's. You have the beginning series, you have beginning postmodernism and 1993. So dear friends, that was my lecture on postmodernism. Thank you, and thank you, St. Thomas College, Thrissur.
Thank you, sir. That was actually an enriching lecture.
Thank you.
Next, we shall have an open forum. Dr. Anto Thomas will coordinate this session for us. He would be putting across the questions and clarifications posted by our participants to Dr. Joseph DORAIRAJ. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor DORAIRAJ, for this enlightening session on postmodernism. You have, within this short duration of time, enlightened us with almost all the aspects and perspectives on postmodernism. Thanks a lot. Now, I have received through the web chat a number of questions, but I have taken most relevant questions and questions that have never been posed before. So to begin with, during this time
I'll take them one by one. I'll take them one by one.
Okay, okay, sir. Okay. So the first question is linked with the present pandemic. Some people would like to get enlightened on postmodernism and pandemic, and they ask, is there any connection with postmodernism and pandemic literature?
I am not sure. I need to think. And at the outset, I would like to confess that I am not very familiar with pandemic literature. Of course, I listened to a good presentation on pandemic literature by my friend in Pondicherry. And so he gave an overview of pandemic literature. Now, the only resemblance that I find, postmodernism on the one hand and pandemic literature on the other, is the variety. Okay, so different writers deal with diseases, whether it is an epidemic or a pandemic, in their own way. Okay, so for instance, we have Camus' The Plague. So he gives a realistic account. And if you go to classical literature, so you have the Theban plague. Okay, so different writers deal with the plague, the epidemic or the pandemic in their own way, but once again taking the local situation into consideration. Whereas in the case of Camus' plague, it is the version of a doctor. And the last sentence is very significant. So he says, for the time being, the virus is dormant. We do not know when the virus will erupt. So there is this uncertainty. Anyway, so that is the doctor's version, and he is true. So the only connection that I find between pandemic literature and postmodernism is, so different writers have their own perspective to epidemics or pandemics. And this is the connection that I have. So the plurality or the multiplicity, but this plurality and this multiplicity is anchored on the given environment or context or situation. I refer to Heidegger's in der Welt sein. Okay, so anchored in a particular given situation or context, and this is my answer.
Sir, the next question is, how does postmodernism affect the change of public administration system, culture, education, and architecture, and vice versa?
No. No, this is an all-encompassing question. You have included a lot of things, policy making, architecture, and other fields also. Now, the only answer is, particularly in policy making, policy decisions, like dissent should be allowed. We should always need to listen to the other person. We need to know the other perspective, the other dimension, because reality is multidimensional. Okay, reality is plural, reality is homogeneous. Okay, I have access to only one side or one part of reality. If I have a mango in front of me, I look only at one side of the mango. The person sitting opposite to me, he or she looks at the other side. Okay, so these two perspectives put together would constitute the whole dimension or the whole perspective. Okay, so therefore, particularly in policy making, in administration, okay, the government should listen to the voices of the other particularly the disenfranchised, the disempowered, the marginalized, women, children, the disabled. Okay, so in architecture also, I gave you the example of the glass pyramid, which is at the threshold, which is at the entry of the Louvre Museum. Okay, so when I went there, I was amazed at the architecture, the variety, and similarly that Sydney Opera House. So postmodernism is marked by variety in the sense it is always willing to listen to the other. Okay, so this is one of the highlights of postmodernism, and this is something that we can draw inspiration from.
Thank you, sir. The next question. The questioner begins with a quotation. Professor Deepankar Misra, in a critical study of Trump, the Postmodernist, which was published in the Hindu Opinion piece, labels the American president to be a practicing postmodernist. Comment on his often bizarre and worrying levels of skepticism towards power and proven sciences as a dangerous precedent to set during the pandemic. Now the question is, what are your thoughts on this exercising of skepticism or the de-legitimization of credible science in times so worrying by those in positions of power?
Okay, now if you ask me, for the last 3 months or so, I am at home. So if you ask me, what do I do at home? So I would tell you, of course, I read and write a lot. Okay, but otherwise, I regularly watch at least half an hour BBC and half an hour CNN, more than half an hour, at least 30 to 45 minutes. I watch CNN, particularly Don Lemon and others. And my understanding of Trump is not a postmodernist because he does not want to listen to other people, other voices. I'll give you an example. 2 or 3 weeks back, Trump had a press conference, and there was a Chinese American, a lady, a Chinese American, and she asked a question. She asked a very difficult, a very comfortable question, and Trump was visibly unhappy. Then later, pointing to that reporter who was a woman and a Chinese American, he said, "You are the ones who have brought this disease to the United States of America." So which means he was very provincial in his attitude. He was narrow and sectarian in his attitude, or to put it differently, Trump is not a postmodernist, and I'll tell you why he is not a postmodernist, because he has limited opinions. Anyway, I can talk boldly because I am not an American. He has very limited understanding of international history, international relations, and he certainly doesn't want to listen to the other view.
We appreciate your answer, sir. It is true. Now,
thank you.
To look at another question, kindly highlight the new research in postmodernism. I mean, the person wants to know about contemporary research.
Okay, fine. Now, a lot of research is being done in the area of films and popular culture. Okay, so of course we do continue our research with the literature of exhaustion advocated by John Barth, or the postmodernist trends in Pynchon's V, or the Gravity's Rainbow, or Calvino. Okay, in addition to these, I think people are interested in looking at postmodernism and films, the interface between films and postmodernism, or the postmodernist trends or echoes or features in films. Or you go to, now today there is a lot of opening in cultural studies, so you can bring in postmodernism and the cultural studies. I gave the example of rap music, the African American rap music, how it is a combination, a synergy between postmodernism on the one hand and popular culture on the other. So these are two areas that are fertile for research, particularly with postmodernism at the backdrop. Films, number one, and popular culture, or the domain of cultural studies.
Thank you, sir, for updating us with this information. Now I come to the last question. The last question is postmodernism a celebration of chaos?
Okay, is postmodernism a celebration of chaos? I would say yes and no, because earlier I said, I raised a question when I talked of the interface between the modernists and the postmodernists. I said both of them lived during the post-war period. For the postmodern writers, it was immediately after the First World War. Sorry, for the modernist writers, it was immediately after the First World War, and for the postmodernists, it was immediately after the Second World War. It started with 1940s. Okay, so both of them had to face a stark, bleak, hopeless environment where there was fragmentation. But how did they look at it? What was their perspective? Okay, so modernists, they lamented it. So there was regret, there was lamentation. Whereas the postmodernists you're talking of, is postmodernism a celebration of chaos? It may not be a celebration of chaos, but it comes to terms with chaos, because before you celebrate, you have to accept that there is fragmentation, there is chaos, there is epidemics, there is pandemics. So you have to come to terms with it. You have to negotiate with that stark reality. And only when you accept that stark reality, only then you can move on to the next phase. So more than a celebration of chaos, postmodernism enables you or helps you, particularly in the philosophical framework, It helps you to negotiate moments of anxiety, moments of despair that are born out of chaos, and it helps you to come to terms with this stark reality. So in that sense, yes, postmodernism is good, but I'm not sure whether it celebrates chaos. It helps you to come to terms with chaos, maybe period, maybe no celebration.
Thank you, sir, for patiently sharing your ideas and elucidating the points. Thank you, Dr. Anto, for moderating the session. It's my pleasure to welcome Reverend Dr. Martin Kolambrath, Vice Principal and Faculty of the Department of English, to propose the vote of thanks.
When one door closes, there will be 1001 doors which are open. A successful person never laments over the closed door. Instead, he or she will be eagerly looking for the newer doors which are open. During the time of COVID, the whole academia is looking for ever new doors to be opened, and hence we have plenty of doors opening to the world of knowledge. So we have conducted this webinar as a joint venture, and we are on the close of it. So first of all, I would like to thank the Honorable Vice Chancellor and Registrar of Gandhigram Rural Institute, deemed to be University Gandhigram, for allowing us to have a joint venture. I also thank Dr. K.L. Joy, our beloved principal, who guides us in every way. And I'm very glad that our resource person of the day, Professor Dr. A. Joseph DORAIRAJ. I was very fortunate to do my PhD under his guidance in Gandhigram. And you know, a resourceful resource person. He had given an extremely tremendous, profound talk, and for all, on behalf of all participants, I extend a heartfelt gratitude towards him. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Anto Thomas C., our HOD, was the moderator, and he has given all the guidance in conducting this seminar, in the organizing part of it. Thank you so much for Dr. Anto Thomas. And we also look forward for more seminars in the future, or webinars. For Dr. Anil George Konkoth, he is our IQAC coordinator, and he has helped us to conduct this webinar in a fruitful way. Thank you so much for the all support given from the part of IQAC, especially the leader, Father Dr. Anil George K. In the department, we have two pillars, the coordinators of this function. It is Dr. Stishin and Dr. Flergin. Both of them are very eager to conduct this seminar. For the last 2-3 weeks, they were after it, and they have done well. Surprisingly, we had more than 4,000 have registered for this webinar, and they have took pains to contact them, to give them link, and to register all the things. They have done very well, fruitfully. I thank them, both of them, from the bottom of my heart. Ms. Christeena was the anchor of this program, and I'm very glad that our Professor Christeena did it well. Thank you so much for Christeena. And all the participants all over India, they have participated in this webinar, and most of them have, nearly 250 of them have given their comments over chat. And also we had so many questions, in which a few we have already posed to the Dr. Joseph DORAIRAJ. So thank you all the participants And we hope that we'll meet again with more future webinars or seminars. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Father Martin. I remain most grateful for the rapt attention with which you sat through the lecture. I'm confident that you have learned something from it. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining in. The Department of English appreciates your participation and involvement. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Christeena. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.